Hello and welcome to this lecture on export processing zones and special economic zones, part of the economic policy analysis module. Now, before we get started with the concepts and evidence, let's have some concrete examples to set the scene. So the first one here is a factory producing rubber gloves. There'll be an example of this from Kerala in India later on, mentioned, where somebody had to check, I think, 10 or 12,000 pairs of gloves a day. This is very large scale. And then I looked at the figures for this factory, which is actually in Malaysia, and the most recent figures I could find were the 2015 second half production were 52 billion pairs of gloves. So that's quite high scale production in Malaysia. The example here, you might have to pause between each of these to see if you can tell where they are, but this one is Madagascar. So it's textile production in Madagascar, ready-made garments. Another export processing zone, which we'll mention as well later in the lecture. This one, pause, have a think, where is this? Okay, some students occasionally get this. This one is actually in Ethiopia, and it's an export processing zone, but it's a Chinese-owned export processing zone in Ethiopia. Next one. Okay, this one is in Mexico along the border with the US. It's the one that I referred to in the lecture on gender and trade. So here we have some maquiladoras, some male workers. As an aside, just as in the lecture on family businesses and small micro enterprises, it was very important to watch the Marvel film Age of Ultron, because that took place in the area where they do the ship disassembly in Bangladesh. Where here you need to have watched the latest in the Terminator series of films, which is just last year, where they visit one of these factories, and as well as some quite interesting interactions between an enhanced human and a Terminator, you have some of the politics about the interaction between humans and machines in the labour force here. So very important to keep up with your science fiction films if you're going to understand these economic development concepts. Next one, completely different scale. Again, any idea where this one is? You press pause. And the answer to this one is Shenzhen in China, where an entire city is a special economic zone. Okay, so this is the kind of territory we're in. We'll talk about, I think all of these examples come up again later in the lecture, either in terms of quant or qual evidence. But the next slide I'll explain the structure of the rest of the lecture. Okay. So this is the structure of the rest of the lecture. First of all, introduction to epzs, sezs and various other acronyms. So what do we mean when we talk about these things? Then in two sections we look at the aims and the benefits. So what are these things trying to achieve and how are they supposed to achieve that and with what beneficial results? Then we look at the flip side of that, some of the many criticisms that are being levelled at these policies. And then we look at some case studies. So there's some econometric data and there's some case study data. And then finally we try and draw out of this stuff what are the lessons for policy that we can conclude. So first of all, let's look at an introduction to export processing zones and sezs. So terminology can get a little bit confusing. There's various things you'll find if you start doing some reading, some researching this. There's FZs, just meaning a free zone, which is really the oldest form. It goes back a long time, well before the current era of thoughts about development. And the free zones that people talk about historically are mainly focusing on trade rather than production. So people being able to do trade without having to pay a lot of taxes and get through a lot of restrictions, not really about manufacturing or servicing or services or adding value in that sense. Then export processing zone, the EPZ, export processing zone. For many years that's what dominated discussion and dominated the literature on developing countries. It's about sometimes called enclaves or small zones designed specifically for export and export promotion and production. There's a term free enterprise, which you sometimes find, which is where you have similar things to an export processing zone, but instead of the companies having to be in a particular geographical location, it's just certain companies register and negotiate to get those benefits of being part of the free enterprise scheme. And it doesn't matter where they are physically, they're just on the register of having those particular conditions. An example of this is Mauritius, which doesn't really have a single focused zone. Then going up in scale somewhat, so you have free ports, and those have been around for quite a long while, but have become bigger recently, and they're very much larger scale, so people are living there. There's, as well as the production, there's retail, there's services for people living there. Often it just includes a whole town or a city, or sometimes even a region, which is when you start getting into the biggest one of all, the special economic zone, which includes some areas in China, like whole coastal zones, and some other places, sort of including free ports within them. So there's a whole lot of different things. Then we move on further, there's lots of others. There's free trade areas, or FTA, free trade zones, FTZ, enterprise zones, FEZ, specialised zones, SZ, EDZs, WAZs, SAZs and JZs. So there's a lot of them, and all of the ones on the previous page, all the ones here are real examples, except one of these is just a joke example, but you have to have seen the film Mystic River or read the book to understand that. But most of these, or all of these except one, actually exist. And also, even though they're all used, the exact way they're used varies between different countries in terms of internal policy documents and also different authors, people writing about them. The only general trend I can find in the literature is that this was the dominant term until maybe the mid-2000s, but recently it's gone much more towards SEZ, and SEZ sort of covers all these things. So SEZ, meaning special economic zone, includes all of these different kinds of arrangements. So I'm pretty sure that I've changed everything to SEZ, or I try to stick to SEZ for most of the things here, except where I'm referring to particular countries, they call it something else. So special economic zone. Well, the background and the concept is, it's the policymaker is trying to shape the incentives in order to encourage the growth and shape the economic growth that results from that. And as I said, it's got a long history, goes back to the Mediterranean city-states and the ancient world. Even some people would say Carthage and that sort of thing was arguably had elements, and the Phoenicians had elements of this kind of policy. Certainly China did it in the ancient world. But once you get to the Middle Ages of Venice, sort of Venice that Shakespeare writes about, Genoa, Marseille, in the also Mediterranean, Gibraltar, but all the Far East, you've got Singapore, 18th and 19th centuries. These very clearly have elements of SEZ about them. But in the modern development era, various places lay claim to it. The most commonly cited one is Ireland, bizarrely, and Shannon Airport as being the first place to develop an export processing zone. And this is where we met from export zone, as in low tariffs and low taxes, much more towards encouraging actual production. And it was to do with the development of longer range air travel, because Shannon Airport had a brief flourishing in the 50s, when to get from Europe to the States, that was the obvious place to fly from, because you couldn't fly non-stop from Paris or from Heathrow, London. You had to first get a boat or a smaller aeroplane to Shannon Airport. Then at Shannon Airport, all the people going from Europe to the US or vice versa would go through there. Now, unfortunately, the late 50s, they started developing airplanes that could just go straight from Paris, straight from Frankfurt over to America. So this was then no longer such a hub. So they had to do something with all this infrastructure. And what they did was they put in place all of these incentives for people to locate next to the airport. And they said, okay, you put your trading, but also your small-scale manufacturing in here. You'll have all these special conditions, plus the benefits of all this capacity now that the passengers don't need to fly your goods in and out cheaply, and your personnel. So it took off as what they claim is the first export processing zone. In the developing world, also pretty early, India got in quite well ahead of the game, 65, great year that. Mexico also 1965, South Korea 1970, and so on. So we'll look at examples from those areas. Okay, so as I said, there's this alphabet soup of different things which we call SEZs of various kinds. But you'll find some places have all this, some places have other things, but this is pretty much the common core to many places. So there'll be a reduction on taxation to people working there, to firms working there, or holidays often saying, okay, you invest here for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, you'll have low or even zero taxation. Similarly for tariffs, specifically the things on exports and imports, there will be reduced or zero tariffs for those areas. Capital controls, so no taxation when they bring tax into the country or when they repatriate profits, more importantly. Whereas many countries, you do pay tax, or there's restrictions on how quickly you can move capital in and out by changing currency and so on. That's reduced or zeroed. Less stringent regulation and all kinds of things, environmental things, and other things like the proportion of local content you use, but particularly labour regulations. So all the usual rules and rights that labour have may be changed or relaxed in some way here. Guaranteed quality, low cost of infrastructure. The idea is that originally it's the government or the state that's doing it will guarantee that everything up to the door of that special export processing zone is there. The connections are there to phones, to electricity, the good roads and so on. Then there's restrictions on in-country sales. Now this is kind of almost, it's a restriction. All these things here are like beneficial things to these companies. But of course, thinking in terms of the internal market effects, or the political economy, if you're a state in India, and we'll see this, or a town, and the government says, all right, we're going to put in here to encourage economic growth, this export processing zone, and they're going to have all these rights and benefits. Suddenly the other local power brokers and businesses in that area are going to say, well, how we're now going to be competing. We're paying all the usual taxes, we're observing all the usual restrictions, yet we're going to compete with these people who have these benefits, who are going to flood us with cheap goods. So often there is restrictions, which is why it's called export processing. All these special conditions are for production which is aimed to be exported. So you carry on protecting your local market, or at least not undercutting your local market. So as that thing happens, and of course some of the problems come from whether this is overdone or underdone. And finally, this is very common, a unified one-stop administration. It's when you try and do things in terms of business in some developing countries, you'll find that you need to go from ministry to ministry to ministry to get different stamps and approvals for things. It's very off-putting, and one ministry won't recognise another ministry's stamp and that kind of stuff. So it can be very complex. So the idea is they step up a one-stop administration. So you get one person, one ministry to sign you off, and that gives you all the approval you need. So here we hit both something great and informative and some very annoying limitation. The limitation is that because of this alphabet soup thing, because the picture is getting more and more diverse, a lot of these policies are being applied by countries in areas which is hard to say, okay, that is a special economic zone of some kind. They might be applied generally in the economy or to broad sections of the economy or for certain periods. So it's getting harder to count exactly what is an SEZ. So what was one of the best sources of data, the International Labour Organization, until 2008, 2010, they were producing this data regularly so you can see the trends, but they haven't got this systematic data anymore. And there are other sources, but they tend to concentrate more, like if you're interested in the Chinese special economic zones or special economic zones of the maquiladoras in Mexico, you can find data on that, but you can't find global data because it's not so easily comparable anymore because it's got so diffuse. I'll show, there is a more recent source from the World Bank, which I'll show you in a bit. But this is really good. It still gives the impression, unfortunately, at the moment, the idea of exponential growth like this is a bit sinister, but you can see whether you count how many countries have them or the numbers, the growth was very fast from the 70s, 80s and so on up to the early 2000s. So we have this exponential growth starting to flatten a bit, as they say, I believe. And this is in terms of employment impact. Total world employment going up to 60 million, now far higher. And here's just to show you that this is the Chinese component of that. Here's the rest of the world component. So China getting on for like a third or more of the growth in employment. And this is, again, interesting snapshot, but it's out of date, 2008. But certainly the early impacts was a lot here, East and South Asia and Latin America. And then, yeah, in Central Asia as well. And very much less. Considering the early start, South Asia is a small part of this. Sub-Saharan Africa, again, very small. And some more figures from the ILO. So we can see that, and this is looking at exports here. It's a misleadingly titled chart because when you look into the text, it actually means manufactured exports. So it's not exports of minerals and primary products and so on. It's just manufactures. So globally, by 2008, 40% of world export trade was originating in SEZs of some kind. There's the breakdown in different regions, fairly consistent between regions actually, even from Africa. And for Africa, high, but that's because it's manufactures, which obviously is a relatively low proportion in sub-Saharan Africa. Globally, very small in terms of employment impact, but then when you look at exports specifically, it's much more significant. Developing economies, similarly pretty small, varies because, of course, defining employment in the context of rural and informal economies is hard. But when you look at exports, it's a really big slice of total exports, and that's 2008 data. It's changed since then. A share of incoming investment, nearly a quarter of Mexico was going to the special economic zones, largely along the border, and over 80% in China of the enormous rise in FDI has gone to these special economic zones. And if you think about it, like China, the background of what most of China is like, the incubators of capitalism were these SEZs, so it's not perhaps that surprising. Lots of others really small, like sub-Saharan Africa. Most investment is still going into things like mineral extraction and so on, and strange schemes like fuel crops. Here's the more up-to-date data, 2016 report. The World Bank has taken this on, and again they sort of try to cope with this diverse definitions in various ways. One is by this direct measurement of economic output using luminosity. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to look at the places where they have got data on SEZs and map that onto these changes in employment, changes in economic output and changes in luminosity. So here, quite a striking one just by remote sensing, looking at, I think this is Vietnam, Vietnam between 2007 and 2012, just looking at the change in luminosity of that same area within 5 years. And this is an area where a lot of SEZ type investment are taking place. So here's the places where they have got data on firms and employment in SEZs, and they find that in both cases it's strongly correlated with nightlights. So they're taking nightlights to be another indicator of the presence of these intensively managed and invested zones. This is the World Bank. If you want to look up the World Bank's program here, is about it's not very catchy title. So they're taking the ILO 2008 database, and if you read, many people not criticise the ILO, but they say it's regretful that there isn't systematic data after that. They're trying to build on from this database, using this to fill in the gaps. And they give a lot of detail, comparative performance of different zones. This interesting question about, okay, the zone is growing, but is that spilling over and generating economic growth in the wider economy? They've got 500 odd in the database, and quite a good slice of those in SSA, in sub-Saharan Africa. So it shows that the growth, sub-Saharan Africa was catching up with other regions in terms of its use of SEZs, and that sort of builds into one particular picture of the way the global economy is going. And here's the database, so you can see it's pretty broadly distributed. And there, I include these really in case anyone is interested in taking further research of this. You can see that this report covers some areas in some depth and gives a lot of information, a lot of different areas here. And here, see this is all going under the heading of Special Economic Zone. But you can see that they're getting into EPZs, FZs, IAs, IDZs, so it gets confusing. Which is why it's hard to get the data in one particular place. Okay, so that's what we mean by EPZs and SEZs, and that's where they're spread so far as we know around the world. Okay, so what, you're a policymaker, what are you doing this for? What do you hope to get out of it? That's the next section we'll look at.